A spiked wine letting cold silent kisses. I feel so lonely since
He's got Vonnegut here.
Yeah. Well, we get everybody. Everybody loves this thing. And the reason they love this thing is because it's not a formula, you see. It's all kinds of things. Well, the first thing I have to say, and I don't think it's any news to you, but it's important to say it anyway, is that the United States, as a colony, is a product of the early globalization. It might be called the mercantilist period of imperialism, when the British and the Dutch and the French, the Spanish came to the New World and colonized the New World, both for the purposes of providing a place for their excess populations to live, like the British did in Australia and New Zealand, and also because this was rapidly understood to be a very rich source of raw materials, the New World, both the Americas, both sides of the Americas. So this became a major source of agricultural commodities, and particularly of cotton, for British textiles. Egypt and India were relatively undeveloped at that point. America was developed, and was developed on the basis of the second aspect of globalization, which was the slave trade, because it was really black slaves from Africa who were hijacked and brought to the United States, who became the labor that produced what for a long time remained the biggest export that this country had, which was cotton, and secondarily wool. So we're a product of the old globalization. Later on, the second stage really in this globalization was that rich sources of oil were found within the United States as well as on the coasts. And this oil not only provided cheap energy for the American industrialization together with coal, we also have very rich sources of coal, but also helped to establish the position of the United States by World War I as one of the leading world powers, economically as well as politically. So that's the second stage of industrialization, still based on the extractive industries, agriculture, oil, coal, cheap sources of energy. also been globalized because the black slaves and the early settlers were only the first of the population. Everyone, I'm sure, knows, including Greeks, that the United States, became a source of a huge migration and immigration from Europe, first Northern Europe and then Southern and Eastern Europe, and the second migration, which was the Southern and Eastern European migration, by far the largest, from Russia, from Italy, from Greece, from Spain, from Portugal, from other places around the Mediterranean as well as in Eastern Europe, supplied the labor for this industrializing period of American capitalism. We don't have any, globalization is no stranger to the development of the United States as a country. I myself am of a family partly Polish, partly Lithuanian. We're all, in a sense, immigrants. The third stage, though, is quite different. I mean, globalization means something much different now. Some of the same qualities we now have, and most people may not know this, we have an immigration to the United States that equals the immigration of 1880 to 1910. This began in 1970. The last 30 years of American life has been filled with a new waves of immigrants. They are not primarily from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe or Northern Europe, not even from Europe. They are from Asia, they are from Latin America primarily, and they are from all kinds of countries of Asia and all sorts of places in Latin America and the Caribbean. We also have a very migrant people. Now, during the early part of the 20th century, the migrant labor came from the southern fields, the post-Reconstruction fields. People who were primarily slaves became sharecroppers and share tenants. And when we had almost an enclosure, as you had in England and many parts of Europe, we had an enclosure here, and blacks and whites came to the automobile factories of the North, the steel factories of the North, and the big cities generally.
Ο Στάνλεϊ Αρόνοβιτς είναι καθηγητής κοινωνιολογίας στο κέντρο μεταπτυχιακών σπουδών του Πανεπιστημίου της Πόλης της Νέας Υόρκης. Άρχισε την καριέρα του ως βιομηχανικός εργάτης και αναμίχθηκε από πολύ νέος στο συνδικαλιστικό κίνημα, όπου έπαιξε σημαντικό ρόλο. Αυτή ακριβώς η άμεση συνδικαλιστική εμπειρία είναι εκείνη η οποία τον οδήγησε βαθμιαία στην κριτική κοινωνική θεωρία και στο μαρξισμό.
Can I have some water, please? I'm sorry.
By now, in the last 10 years or 20 years, we have an enormous growth of unemployment all over the world.
Yes.
We have an enormous growth in inequalities, in income inequalities, in job inequalities all over the world. And we have an enormous number of persons who are by now unemployable within the traditional system of industrial relations as we used to know it. But to what extent has technology, within this new globalized environment, being responsible for a new kind of technical division of labor and new problems of the labor movements the world over.
It has been the result of the power of U.S.-based transnational corporations and the American state. It's been within their power in the 1990s to partially displace the degree of technological unemployment in the United States to other parts of the world. And the way they have exported unemployment is by making the United States a quintessential service economy. They have not cut public employment as they promised to do in the 1990s because they knew that if they cut it too much, that will make the problem that much worse. But they've basically, reconfigured, they basically restructured the labor force to make it possible for that export to take place. And this is the way it's worked. We have in this country a small tradition of employment which is based on temporary, contingent, and part-time work. In the late 80s and 90s, the temporary, contingent, and part-time work exploded. We have in this country now 28% of all new jobs that are created as temporary jobs. That is not true in Germany. That's not true in France. It's not even true in Great Britain. The full-time job still is a major source of jobs, but not as much as before. The contingency of even full-time jobs is very, very important. For example, the new industry, what is called the new economy of high tech, of information and communications industries, Microsoft, Sun Systems, Apple Computer, and many of the others, they develop a two-tier system. The first tier are people who have real jobs. That is, they have benefits, they have job security, they have a pension program in our country. We have a federal pension program which is inadequate. Many companies have to supplement the pension program in order to attract labor. So that there's a small group, large but relatively small group in each corporation of technically competent people in the technical sector who are fully employed, and then they have a larger group who are basically part-time or temporary contingent workers.
We can care about each other. We can look at each other and know that we have goals that other people care about.
One of the fastest trains. Fastest train. One of the fastest trains. One of the fastest train.
In the world today, there are 1.5 billion people who are either fully unemployed or underemployed, and that number is growing. In our book, The Jobless Future, William DeFazio and I claimed that it was not that work was disappearing, but that jobs were disappearing. We didn't call it the workless future, we called it the jobless future, because many people are working on these bases. And we have a metaphor that we describe the situation in. We say nothing any longer is nailed down. You cannot depend that your job will be there tomorrow, the next day, 2 weeks from now, 2 years from now, even if today you are making a decent wage. And as a result of that, I moved to what's happening is that in parts of the world, which is, by the way, one of the more important sources of struggle here, class struggle in this country, women and children are working in low wage, I mean, absolutely starvation wage jobs, making sneakers, making clothing, making all kinds of things, radios, electronic equipment in China. Many others are unemployed, but those women and children are super exploited, working 12 hours a day, working 7 days a week, and there have been more and more examples been given in the press about that. So that what we're beginning to get is a very odd situation. As you said in your question, it is not that the industrialized countries no longer have production industries, but the numbers of people who work in those jobs which are fairly stable, any jobs that are fairly stable, is diminishing year after year. And that makes it extremely difficult to consider strikes. Because when we have a strike, and it doesn't matter what the industry, capital investment now is not like it was in the old steel industry. You can actually take a whole industry, put it on a truck, put it on a train, put it on a boat, put it on an airplane, and move it to another country. Workers are really afraid that if they are too militant in the production industries, they will lose their jobs. We have large numbers of women who've entered the wage labor force over the last 20 years, so that now a majority of women in the United States are employed outside the home as well as inside the home. These women have become a new source of support for the labor movement, on the one hand. On the other hand, most of them have two jobs. One job for wages and one job full-time at home. So we use the word the double shift. We use they work a second shift. And that means they work from 6 o'clock in the morning to 12, often to 11 o'clock at night, and they have no time to do anything, much less join a union or engage in struggle. Having said that, the basic problem that we face with all of those objective factors, the basic problem that we face is the labor movement itself. The labor movement is still a movement which is tied to the old assumptions. Show me an industrial plant, show me a large group of workers who are concentrated in the same geographic space, and I know what to do as an organizer. But show me these new forms of organization, part-time, temporary, contingent work, women, people working in all kinds of rural areas all over the country, in retail industries and in high-tech industries, and the unions haven't got a clue. They don't know what to do. They haven't thought about it strategically. And this is one of the this is a legacy of the anti-intellectualism of the American labor movement. The American labor movement was brilliantly successful as long as the job was done by the employer. You know, I will bring, 140,000 people in River Rouge in Detroit, and they will make cars from the level of steel to the level of the finished car, and you know what to do because they're all in the same place. But give the American labor movement a problem of this kind, and it's not just that it doesn't have the ingenuity, it doesn't have the theory to explain what is in fact going on and to be able to understand how the multinationals function. And in a sense, it reverts to, and I hate to say it, it sounds so basic you want to sort of cry. There's a book, it's called Capital by Karl Marx, the second volume on circuits of capital, where he explains the various forms of capital and how it might be organized. And, well, that's so far from the consciousness of the typical labor leader in the United States, it's not even funny. The second problem that we have, obviously, in the American labor movement is that the workers who are organized, with a lot of exceptions, they are trying to organize the working poor. I will give them that. They're trying to organize in Los Angeles, they're trying to organize farm workers. But in general, the labor movement still represents the highly paid industrial workforce, craft workers. They just settled with Northwest Airlines for mechanics for $30 an hour. I mean, it's a very highly paid group. The labor movement is a movement of, I don't want to use the word loosely, but of a labor aristocracy. Insecure labor aristocracy, but an aristocracy nevertheless. And two things. One, the working poor they have no approach to, and that's a growing part of our own sense of proletarianization of our own population. They have no approach generally. And two, they haven't conceptualized the problems in the leading sectors, the leading technology sectors. They don't know what the grievances are of programmers, of systems analysts, of engineers.
Δραστήριος και πολυπράγμων, ο Αρόνοβιτς εξακολουθεί σήμερα, μετά από 3 και πλέον δεκαετίες πανεπιστημιακής και πολιτικής δράσης, να είναι ένας από τους ένανθρους εκπρόσωπους της ριζοσπαστικής πολιτικής σκέψης στην ΗΠΑ. Διακρίνεται επίσης για τον ακούραστο ακτιβισμό του, τόσο στο συνδικαλιστικό όσο και στον εκπαιδευτικό χώρο.
The American labor movement grew up under the shadow of the belief that in this country there were only interest groups and no classes. And one of the reasons that that took root in a large number of sectors of the American working class was because of the willingness of employers and the ability of the skilled workers in the basic industries to carve out for themselves a position of privilege. The skilled trades in the steel industry, for example, had a separate union, while the unskilled workers had no union for many years. In the construction industry, the skilled tradesmen were able to set up what might be described as a job monopoly. It was not only a job monopoly for skilled versus unskilled or semi-skilled, it was a job monopoly of white men against black men and black women, and women generally. So we had a situation where over time, this tremendous distinction between skilled and unskilled, between men and women, between black and white, became the way in which the class itself constituted itself and understood itself not as a class but as a group that had specific interests in specific industries, and if it had any political interests, those interests were to get legislation, at least until the 1930s, legislation which would effectively exclude other people from being able to compete for their jobs. So it became, in some sense, what may be described as a job-conscious American working class. Even when, in the 1930s, large numbers of industrial workers were organized, that is, semi-skilled and unskilled workers in the basic industries, millions and millions of them were organized, it was still important to know that within those industries, the unions were always obliged to separate, both by law and by custom, the position of the skilled workers from the position of the semi-skilled and unskilled workers. So that there was never really a sense of solidarity, except for very few years of between 1935 and 1939. And then it ended, and then it changed. The third thing that happened, which was very important, as distinct from every place but UK, was that we always had a federation of unions by trade, by industry, by occupation. We never had a labor movement in the proper meaning of the term. The American Federation of Labor was an alliance of separate unions in separate industries and separate occupations and separate trades. And as a result, when they saw themselves as a movement in the brief period, for example, during the fight for the shorter workday, for the 8-hour day, these were exceptions to the general rule of the idea that they were part of their industry, part of their occupation and trade. Now, so it meant that workers saw their interests to be that of the steel employers, or saw their interests to be that of the building trades employers, and often the unions went to legislatures and to the Congress to try to plead for the interests of their industry. The labor movement never had its own party. It didn't have a labor party, it didn't have a socialist party, it didn't have a communist party that saw themselves as the party of the class, as its representation within the capitalist state. Even if it was fighting for reforms, it was fighting for reforms in behalf of the class. In our country, the labor movement aligned itself really from 1908. That was Gompers, he really did that, president of the AFL. When he supported William Jennings Bryan. It allied itself more or less continuously, a couple of exceptions, 1924 and 1972. It allied itself with the Democratic Party, and it saw itself as part of a coalition, which was called the New Deal Coalition or the Roosevelt Coalition, a grand coalition, interclass coalition, that it played an important but never a dominant role. C. Wright Mills called them a junior partner of the Democratic Party. A dependent variable is another word that he used. And they saw themselves primarily as Democrats. And the distinction was largely institutional and somewhat ideological. Ideological in the sense the Democrats were, quote unquote, for the working people, but they were not of the working people. And that's a very important distinction. There were moments in the history of the American labor movement when they thought of there was a possibility that they could have formed themselves into their own political party. One moment was the Eugene V. Debs campaign of 1912. Another moment was La Follette's campaign of 1924. Then there were times after the Second World War when various labor leaders would threaten to leave the Democratic Party if it did not show more interest and more support for labor's demands. But none of that happened. And one of the reasons it didn't happen, the superficial reason, is because they were lined up against the Soviet Union, lined up in the Cold War. That's not the deep reason. The deep reason is that American unions are afraid of class politics. It's as simple as that. They're afraid that they're going to be isolated. They're afraid they're going to be beaten. They have become totally dependent upon their own employers, upon the capitalist state, and for that reason, to a large extent, they will conduct only really local and regional struggles.
In which case, what are the perspectives of class struggle in the United States now?
Globalization has convinced more labor leaders, quite apart from the rank and file, the members, but more labor leaders that they have to unite with other labor movements around the world than anything that has happened in a century. During the World Trade Organization demonstrations in Seattle, the AFL-CIO officially supported the demonstration. The steel workers, the longshore workers, the dock workers, the garment workers led the fight. They identified themselves strongly with an international movement that was trying to stem the power of the World Trade Organization to regulate working conditions and to reduce labor's living standards. This, more than anything, at the moment, is the scene of class struggle. The second part of it is that as labor has become more interested, the unions have become more interested in the organization of the working poor. They are coming up against the priorities of transnational corporations who have been exporting jobs, exporting working conditions, literally, to low-wage countries, and they're very much interested in that fight. Now, it has an element of self-interest in the most narrow sense. They don't want jobs to be lost, even though those jobs are low-paying. They don't want those jobs to be lost to workers in the United States. But at the same time, it's put them in a new militancy, I would call it. It's not class struggle in the old sense, but it's a new militancy. They're willing to take up certain fights. They're willing to take on certain transnational corporations, and they're willing to take on the national state. Having said that, I also have to say something that I think is rather, if not depressing, it's a word of caution. During the 2000 presidential campaign, the unions were so closely allied, and the 96 campaign of Bill Clinton, the unions were so closely allied with the Democrats and with the administration that they were hesitant to take on issues of concern to the working class. And I give you two examples. In 1996, in the middle of the re-election campaign of Clinton, he signed away income guarantees that had been established in the New Deal. It's called welfare reform. Now, people thought about welfare reform in many different ways, but the fact of the matter is that in the United States, the aid to the unemployed, the permanent unemployed, which is income guarantees, is the only floor under wages that we have as a national program. We no longer have a floor under wages as a national program except the minimum wage. But this said anybody who's a human being gets a certain amount of money because living, it's not their fault that they don't have a job. That has been taken away, and it was taken away by the Democrats, not by the Republicans. And the unions were very, very quiet because they were afraid that if they took on Clinton, they would have impeded his re-election. And that is a scandal. The Knowledge Factory, which is my latest book, is a book about the American post-secondary education system. And it discusses many of the issues that I discussed in this interview, which is the growing corporatization of the American higher education system and how corporations are more and more taking over the higher education system in the United States. The Politics of Identity, which is called Class, Culture, and Social Movements, is about ethnicity, race, and about working class identity in the United States and their relationship to the social movements, particularly the feminist movement, the civil rights movement, and the environmental movement. Education Under Siege, which I wrote with Henry Giroux, is a book about the development and the decline of the American education system and about the decline especially of intellectual concepts as the basis for education. It's called The Conservative, Liberal, and Radical Debate Over Schooling. And this is a book that's been translated into several languages. The Jobless Future, which I published in 1994 with Professor William DeFazio of St. John's University, is a book which speaks about the results of technological change and the global economic transformations that have been taking place since the 1970s. It claims that on a world scale, as well as in the United States, good jobs are declining and are virtually disappearing, and that the labor force is being restructured so that low wages for many, and decent and high wages for a few are becoming the norm. It also argues that we have a technology which is not neutral, but is really in the service of the large corporations on a transnational scale.
Technology is never neutral, of course.
Of course not.
But to what extent can one think that all these political problems are also connected to the new planned role of technological innovation in this period?
Technology has a relatively independent path. Technological inventions, developments, deriving largely from science, have on the one hand the products of research laboratories which have been established under conditions which I'll get to in a minute. But on the other hand, increasingly, at least since the late 1930s, were directly sponsored by national states and large corporations, drawing from national states research which had to do with the military. Manuel de Landa has made a very important point which I find compelling, which doesn't mean it's true. And that point is that war is among the most important, Frederick Engels made the same point, is one of the most important sources of technological advance that we can see in modern civilizations from the 16th century on. Having said that, what happens under those circumstances increasingly is that technological development is not neutral. In the first place, it is recruited to war, but then when the wars end temporarily, although they never really end, we never have an end of war. We're in a period, by the way, of the permanent war. Wars are continuous, and they always provide the basis for government funding of technological development, which finds its way into new forms of weaponry. So that's one major way in which technology is no longer simply the result of a group of scientists working together as a collegium to try to improve the lot of mankind. It has a lot to do with what is necessary for war purposes. The other thing that happens is that when the periods of war are at least abated, governments divest themselves of their patents in some of this new technology, the war technology, and they let corporations, some of them new, created by war funding, some of them old, who moved into war funding, they let corporations and sometimes universities in the United States, the research university in the United States is a major source of technological innovation. They let them develop the technologies for private purposes. Now, having said we talk about technology, we always have to remember that technology is profoundly dependent upon science. Relatively speaking, the amount of federal money going into universities as well as into other places for technological development, scientific development, was already beginning to decline. So what happens is that the universities, together with the big corporations, begin to get married. They make a deal. They form an alliance in return for ownership of the patents of the scientifically based technological development. The university is funded by these private corporations in places like pharmaceuticals, in places like information technologies, in places like biotechnology, all these kinds of things. And they become more and more dependent upon not the government so much anymore, although still the government, but upon these transnational corporations who appropriate scientific developments and sometimes the technological developments and transform them into products. At the same time, the Bush administration, which is, as we are recording this, this interview, is about 60 days old, 90 days old. The Bush administration has decided that the use of technological innovation for the purposes of maintaining economic growth overrides considerations of the environment. And that has meant that the Bush administration has refused to implement President Bill Clinton's last edicts, which would provide for lower arsenic in our water, lower proportion of arsenic in our water, to provide for some controls over the air and water pollution, against the development of oil in Alaska, against the development of oil in the Gulf Coast. And so we have the beginnings of a new political question developing in the United States, and possibly a new political struggle, not only between environmentalists and the Bush administration, but between certain forms of the transnational corporations and of the national state, whose alliance is now beginning to express itself in a very nationalistic way. And the nationalistic way is, we don't care what Europe thinks. We don't care what the rest of the world thinks. We don't care what our own people think. We are oriented to economic growth, and for that purpose, we need this technological development.